Hey, welcome back to Love Wins. I'm excited we're finally here to start this new series. It's been quite a week with forest fires we've been having here and other things that have been going on. But I wanted to start this week, and we are starting this week. It might be the very end of the week, but we're here. I'm not even sure what to call this, so it'll be as much a surprise to me as it is to you when the video goes up and it has a title. The subject that I want to tackle is the Sabbath, and this is not a video about when the Sabbath is, it's a video about what the Sabbath is. So I haven't made a big deal out of it, but I don't want to hide who I am either. So I am a Seventh day Adventist. I had this t shirt on. I'm like, should I change it? Should I not change it? I'm like, no, I'm using your time as you watch. You deserve to know who I am and where I'm coming from. So I'm a Seventh day Adventist. I'm not proud of being a Seventh day Adventist. I'm not ashamed of being a Seventh day Adventist. I'm proud of Jesus. I'm a follower of Jesus, and I'm a Seventh day Adventist because I believe at this moment in my life, the theological understandings of the Seventh day Adventist Church are the closest that I know of to what the Bible teaches. You may disagree with that, but I'm glad you're here. If you want to hear me out on this subject, I think you'll be glad you did. So I grew up in the Seventh day Adventist Church from a kid, and Sabbath afternoon, Sabbath day was a day of boredom, really. Um, yeah, I can't say that I look forward to Sabbath. I look forward to church. I look forward to being around people at church. Had an amazing pastor when I was like 11, 12, 13, 14 in those formative years. Loved his preaching. But the rest of the day was kind of awkward, and you kind of watched the clock waiting for it to be over because you didn't want to make a mistake on the Sabbath or do something you shouldn't do. So I said the Sabbath, this wouldn't be about when the Sabbath is. I believe it's Saturday, the seventh day of the week from creation. But I'm not here to make that point because I think even as Seventh Day Adventists, even though we know when it is, we don't know what it is. And let me begin by illustrating it this way: the people who killed Jesus were strict Sabbath keepers. So knowing when Sabbath is does not mean you know God. It doesn't mean you know the truth. It doesn't mean anything really, other than you happen to know when the Sabbath is. I want to also point out at the very beginning of this, I'm going to try and do this in two videos. We'll see how it goes. So I want to spend this video introducing the problem, and the next video introducing the solution, or what I believe the Sabbath is. So in the Gospels, Jesus healed that we know of, and that's important to say that. The Gospels are not a comprehensive story. John says that if everything Jesus had done had been written down, the world couldn't contain the books. But if you add up in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the miracles that are attributed to Jesus on the Sabbath day, there's 7 of them. Surprise, surprise. So the first one is in Matthew 12, where he heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath in the synagogue. In Luke 4, he heals a demon-possessed man at church, at the synagogue. And then he goes to Peter's home for lunch, the first connection between Jesus and Peter. And Peter's mother-in-law is sick, and he heals her on the Sabbath day. In Luke 13, he heals a woman who'd been bent over with some kind of physical infirmity for 18 years and was roundly criticized for that. In Luke 14, he healed a man on the Sabbath who had dropsy. In John 5, he heals a man by the pool, which was literally a stone's throw away from the temple. Also on the Sabbath, also criticized. And in John chapter 9, probably the most controversial or head-to-head knocking of wills about the Sabbath, Jesus healed a man born blind. There are other conflicts on the Sabbath over practices. Like there was a day where Jesus' disciples were walking along the road and they took some grain from the field and they ate it, and they were criticized for harvesting on the Sabbath. There were other issues like that on the Sabbath, but specifically healings, there were 7. And the point I want to make with this is that Jesus knew, he well knew, that doing these things on the Sabbath, in the synagogue or near the temple, or making a man carry his bed through the community on the Sabbath, that all of these things would be offensive, that they would raise the religious ire of the people. And he did them. So he wasn't just, it's not like he was like, oh, I'm going to do this and I hope everyone's okay with it. No, he knew they wouldn't be okay with it and chose to do it anyway. Which tells me that Jesus was making a point that for the most part they didn't get. And I believe that point was centered around him trying to expose not when the Sabbath is, but what the Sabbath is. And I believe it's a lesson that we still have not learned. I believe the lesson is centered in what the one story the Bible is trying to teach. The Sabbath is just one angle or one path through which Jesus is trying to reteach this one singular point. I want to look specifically, should have got more prepared. I want to look specifically at the woman who had this infirmity for 18 years. So it's in Luke 13. If you want to follow along, grab a Bible wherever you're at, or your phone, or your tablet, or whatever you have in your hand. If you follow along with the story, you're going to get more out of it. Luke chapter 13. Here's the story. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years, and she was bent over and in no way could raise herself up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her to himself and said to her, "Woman, you are loosed from your infirmity." And he laid his hand on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. You would think that that would be an amazing, happy, glorious moment. But, verse 14, but the ruler of the synagogue, that would be a pastor in today's minister, priest, in today's language, in today's context, in our culture. But the pastor, the ruler of the synagogue, answered with indignation, with anger, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And he said to the crowd, to the congregation, "There are 6 days on which men ought to work. Therefore come and be healed on them, and not on the Sabbath day." The Lord then answered him and said, "You hypocrite, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to water? So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, think of it, for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath." And when he said these things, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the multitude rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. So there you have it. You have the religious establishment and their rules and their understandings clashing with what Jesus is doing and demonstrating and teaching. In other words, if we don't know Jesus, if we don't understand Jesus, if we don't get Jesus, if we don't see the world and religion and the Bible and rules and people and mercy and compassion from his perspective, we're going to miss it. We might know when the Sabbath is and we might make a huge deal out of it, but we won't know what it is. And if we don't know what it is, we don't know anything. In our next video, I'm going to take you back to the Old Testament. I'm going to take you back to the day that Jesus reintroduced, and when I say Jesus, I mean Jesus, and we'll talk about that, if not in that video at some point. Jesus is all through the Old Testament. He said so in the New Testament. I'm going to take you back to the Old Testament to the day that Jesus introduced, or I should say week, to the week that Jesus reintroduced the Sabbath to the freed slaves who had left Egypt, that he delivered out of Egypt. Many people will tell you today that the Sabbath is a Jewish thing, it's for the Jews, but it's not. It begins right in creation. In Genesis chapter 1, the Jews don't come along until much, much later. And even they lost the Sabbath during their time of slavery in Egypt. And when they come out, Jesus reintroduces the Sabbath. And when we explore how he does it, we will gain a profound understanding of why he made the Sabbath to begin with, what it is, and what we are to learn from it. And I'm telling you, it's good. It's really good. We'll see you next time.